So what happens prior to 1096, prior to the First Crusade? And because once I was in school, let's say third, fourth, fifth grade, I was told, although Lithuania is a very Christian country, Catholic country, but I was told that the Crusades were horrible. Incidents, innocent people were killed, slaughtered, raped, and etc.
Right. The country you come from, and Estonia and those sort of Baltic regions don't like the Crusades because they were Christianized in parts of those Crusades, including at the hands of the Teutonic Knights, a military order, a Catholic military order. So the original Crusades had nothing to do with that. It was against Islam. And the very first crusade, which was called in 1095, was completely against Muslims because they were persecuting and horrifically killing Christians and destroying churches. And going back now to Constantine and the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was a pilgrimage site since before Constantine, but especially after Constantine, and it continued being a pilgrimage site even after the Muslim conquest of the Holy Land around 637. But Christians would suffer, and they had to pay taxes, and sometimes they would be attacked and killed by Muslims, but they still would go as a sacrifice because holy sites were very important back in those days. So that goes on. I'm just going a little before the First Crusade. And then by the time of, around 900 or 1000, the Turks start rising and they become a very dominant force in the Islamic world. And they're Muslims. They were originally imported as slave soldiers by the caliphates, especially the Abbasid Caliphate at that time. And they would bring these Turkic warriors and convert them to Islam, and they became the greatest warriors. And then before you know it, they actually became the standard bearers of jihad, and the Arabs' time wanes. And really, the caliphate is a puppet figure, the Abbasid Caliphate, which the Turks keep, but they're in charge, they're in power. And under them, the first dynasty really is, well, not the first, but the more dominant one is the Seljuk Turks. And they start attacking Asia Minor in around the middle of the 11th century, 1050. And very horrific. The bloodshed is just mind-boggling as it's recorded in the sources, especially of Armenians, because Armenians are a large nation at this time in Asia Minor, but also as they go later, further in, against Greeks and so forth. And the records, Matthew of Edessa is a chronicler who's a near contemporary. He talks about tens of thousands of Christians being massacred, even more enslaved.
Just because they refused to convert?
Yeah, by the Turks. And churches ritually desecrated and destroyed in one city, Ani, which was the capital at the time of Armenia. It was known as the city of 1,001 churches. They were all burned and destroyed. And a large crucifix was sent to Baghdad as a trophy of war, again, underscoring the ideological aspect to this. And also the pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land to see the Holy Sepulchre were being attacked in very vile ways. One of the more famous and horrific instances was a large German pilgrimage, which was in 1064 or 1065. And they talk about how they attacked and killed everyone, and they took a nun and gang raped her until she died in front of everyone. And the eyewitness says, and the Turks did this often to pilgrims. And that's what gave rise to the First Crusade in 1095.
Just to spread the horror?
Just the sheer horror and attacks on Christians. And so Pope Urban II in 1095, in part responding to the Roman Emperor Alexius, who was now under, because all these were formerly Eastern Roman Byzantine territories. So he asked for aid from the West, and he described what was happening. And that's exactly what Pope Urban and all the other preachers of the First Crusade were talking about, which is what was happening to Christians, what was happening to the Holy Land, what was happening to pilgrims. And that was the rise of the First Crusade. It was a noble venture. It was altruistic. It was about actually righting wrongs. They actually would quote the verse that, no greater love does a man have than to lay down his life for his fellow man. And that's what they were doing. And also in the context of, loving God and loving your fellow man. So loving your fellow man was going on a crusade to help Eastern Christians. Loving God was going to go and liberate the Holy Land. Because they were mocking. So in 1009, which is even way before 1095, one caliph, the Holy Sepulchre, the large, massive complex that Constantine built, he destroyed it. He completely destroyed it, plundered it, and he destroyed 30,000 other churches according to Muslim sources. Most Western historians don't say this. They say
30,000.
30,000, and most Western historians will put the number 300 or 3,000, and they'll say, oh, that's a scribal error. The Muslims are wrong. But it's a Muslim. It's al-Makrizi. It's an Egyptian historian.
So they were not just boasting. They
No.
were telling the truth.
Yeah. And it's a reflection of how Christian that region was. Because before the Islamic conquest, even in 1009, that's only 400 years later, it was still a very, very heavily Christian region, Egypt and Greater Syria. So 30,000 churches and the Holy Sepulchre destroyed. So all of that, and the Christians of Europe remembered that. So that's what gave rise and led to the First Crusade.
What was the draft like in the First Crusade?
The draft?
Yeah, who was those people?
There was no draft. It was unbridled enthusiasm, and it was women and children, peasants. You couldn't stop them. They were so, and it's actually considered one of today's great mysteries, because there were calls to other crusades before that, including when that caliph destroyed the sepulchre and the 30,000 churches. That too provoked a lot of Christians in the West, but nothing came of it. But for some reason, when Pope Urban called for this one, it's known in history as one of the most massive campaigns, where it was hundreds of thousands of just peasants took off to the Holy Land.
What they were promised?
Okay, so they were promised remission of sins. So if you go and you die, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were promised remission of sins. It was a pilgrimage. The Crusades were actually pilgrimages. So Christians wanted to do and should do pilgrimages to the Holy Land. And the Crusade was seen as an armed pilgrimage. So you're doing two things. You're going to go and you're going to fight the pagans and help Christians and liberate the Holy Land. And you're going to do the pilgrimage, which you should do. Okay, so yeah, there were incentives, of course, which was the remission of sins was the main big one. But they were also, if you look at the sources, the people were really driven just by the actual events themselves. So we can say, yeah, there was a theological component that motivated them. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it was really trying to redress all these wrongs that I just described, because that comes out in the sources. That's what really they preached, Urban, Peter the Hermit, and all these other preachers. And that's what really drove the people to go on the crusade.
Any documented atrocities from those people from the Crusades?
Yeah, the main ones, especially, you have different movements, because it wasn't a coherent force, like I was saying. It was just people on their own started going. And among some of them is, they're known as the peasant crusaders. And so they were leaderless peasants. And, the main attacks was on Jews that happened in Europe. Right, I think I want to say maybe 1096 or right around 1097, around Germany. And their logic, the peasants would rile each other up because they'd be traveling by land on foot and they'd get tired. And they say, why are we going all the way to fight the Muslim haters of Christ when we have them right here in our own land, the Jews? Mm-hmm. And so they would attack them and plunder them. But it's notable to point out that the actual authorities, the church, and even the higher nobles would come against it. They would condemn it, and they would actually try to defend the Jews. And they would sometimes even excommunicate the Christians who did this.
The Great Schism occurred in what year?
I think the formal year, it's in the year 1000 something. I don't know, 1012 or 1094.
So it's after the Crusade?
No, it's before.
Before?
It's before.
So there was Orthodox already and Catholics?
Yeah, the Catholics and the Orthodox, as we call them today, always existed. But, today Orthodox is big O and Catholic is big C. But historically, they were both small o and both small c. Catholic just meant universal. Orthodox meant the straight way. Till today, Catholics tell you we're the Orthodox ones because we're the straight way. Mm-hmm. And the Orthodox tell you, no, we're the universal church. So, these terms, they have their traditional meaning and they have now their big meaning.
So in total, there were how many Crusades? 8?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, but traditional number is 9.
So let's say they didn't succeed. What kind of world would we live in right now?
Well, really, the only one that did succeed is the first one that we're talking about. And it was essentially, the actual conquests or reconquests that they made were all nullified by 1291. So by 1099, the Crusaders, a few years after the first crusade is called in 1095, they've achieved their goal. They've liberated the Holy Land. Jerusalem is under Christian, Latin, Frankish control, as well as other cities.
And they stayed there?
Yeah, they stayed there. They liberated Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, various other areas. And they stayed there and they continued fighting the Muslims until 1291. So almost 200 years. And by 1291, that's when basically they're completely eliminated and kicked out of the Holy Land. Aisha, his young wife, his child bride, who I believe married when she was 9, though he had possession of her when she was 6. What we would call, then it would be normal. Oh, I'm a Muslim man, I'm 30, I'm 40, and I'm going to marry a 9-year-old. You can have 4 wives and as many slaves as you want, concubines. And they talk about how they attacked and killed everyone, and they took a nun and ganged her until she died in front of everyone. And the eyewitness says, and the Turks did this often to pilgrims. Jihad of the pen, jihad of the tongue, jihad of the money, jihad of the womb. And all of them are to serve Islam, to empower it over infidels. And a Muslim is one who submits. But if you really went to it, it was a political thing. I'm superior, I'm the warlord, you're joining me, you're submitting to me in what I say, which comes from God. And that was it. He claims he's from God, but his modus operandi, the way he behaves, is all about violence, warfare, plunder, sexuality, concubinage, etc. England, it's reached the point where you can't even say the truth about what's happening without going to jail. So obviously the rulers of England, whether they are British natives, hate and are warring on their own people.